The silver was wrong. Cecily Vane knew it before she reached the sideboard, before the footman's boy lifted the lid from the second épergne and the candlelight caught what was not there. She had counted the pieces herself that morning, her bare hands on cold metal, her lips moving with the inventory her late father had pressed into her from girlhood. 18 serving spoons, 4 ladles, one with the family crest worn almost to shadow. 6 candlesticks, the matched pair and the 4 tall ones from the set her grandmother had brought from Derbyshire. She had counted them all and written the numbers in the small ledger she carried inside her apron pocket. The ladle was gone. She stood in the service corridor with the warm smell of roasting meat drifting past her, and she did not move. The household of Thornvale Park was preparing for the dinner that would, according to Lady Pamela Ashcroft, settle the matter of the estate once and for all. 14 guests, 2 solicitors, and 1 lord who had not yet arrived. Cecily had 40 minutes before the soup course. She pressed her thumb against the ledger in her pocket and said nothing. She was, to all appearances, the housekeeper's assistant. The cap on her head was starched and white and tilted forward in the manner Mrs. Poole had shown her, which was to say slightly too far, in the fashion of a woman who had worn caps since she was 14 and had developed opinions about them. The apron she wore was Mrs. Poole's second best, linen gone soft with washing, and it tied at her back with the particular knot a woman learns when she has tied the same apron every morning for 30 years. The guests who arrived that evening would see a capable young woman in a servant's plain dress, moving efficiently between the kitchen and the dining room, and they would not look at her twice. That was not carelessness on the guests' part. It was the ordinary operation of a world that had decided what a woman in a white cap was, and had never found occasion to reconsider. That was the arrangement. That was precisely the arrangement. What none of them knew was that Thornvale Park belonged to Cecily Vane. It had belonged to her father, and to his father before him, and to 4 generations of Vanes who had stood in this same kitchen corridor, smelling the same winter herbs and candle wax and the particular damp of old stone. Her father had walked her through every room of Thornvale Park on the summer she turned 15 and told her which things were entailed and which were not, which pieces of furniture had come down through the family, and which had been purchased in his own lifetime, where the household accounts were kept, and how to read them, and why a woman who knew the inventory of her own house was a woman who could not easily be displaced from it. She had listened with the close attention she gave everything he said, and she had not known then that the lesson was preparation for a use she would ever need to make of it. The entail had been clear. The solicitor her father trusted had been clear. And then her father had died in the autumn, a sudden fever in the second week of October that moved so fast the doctor could do nothing but witness it. And by November, Lady Ashcroft, her father's widowed sister-in-law, and the woman who had lived at Thornvale as a guest for 11 years, had produced a document that Cecily had never seen, and that 2 witnesses Cecily could not name had apparently signed. The document gave Lady Ashcroft guardianship of Cecily and management of the estate for as long as Cecily remained unmarried. It also, in a clause buried in the middle of the 3rd page, granted Lady Ashcroft power to lease or sell any household contents she deemed surplus to requirements. The clause was written in the same clean formal hand as the rest of the document, unremarkable among the other clauses, designed to be read past. Cecily had read it 4 times. Then she had taken the cap Mrs. Poole kept on a hook inside the kitchen pantry, and she had pressed it onto her own head. If someone was removing pieces from the silver inventory, she intended to know who it was before any solicitor sealed any transaction over a candlelit dinner tonight. Cecily set the ladle's absence aside for 20 minutes and worked. The guests required attending. Mr. Fothergill, the solicitor, arrived with his associate at 6:15, and Cecily poured their wine and listened as Lady Ashcroft greeted them in the hall with the particular warmth she reserved for men who held documents she needed signed. Lord Hargrove and his wife arrived next. Then the Mrs. Pendleton, whose diamonds were wide enough to catch light from across the room. Then various county neighbors whose names Cecily knew from her father's letter files, and whose faces were half familiar and wholly unsuitable for trust. The last carriage brought the Earl of Westhaven. Cecily heard his name announced from the hall and did not look up from the wine she was pouring. She had not expected him. Lady Ashcroft had not mentioned him, which was itself a thing worth noting, because Lady Ashcroft was a woman who mentioned every guest in order of usefulness at least once in the 3 days before any gathering, and an earl was the kind of guest whose name would ordinarily have appeared in her conversation with the frequency of a well-rehearsed point. His absence from those conversations suggested that he had been invited by someone else, or that Lady Ashcroft had reasons of her own for keeping his name quiet, and neither of those possibilities was without interest. His presence at a dinner, whose announced purpose was the settlement of an estate matter, was either accidental or deliberate. And the Earl of Westhaven, by all Cecily's father's accounts, was not a man who did things accidentally. She saw him when he entered the drawing room. He was 34 years old, with dark hair going gray at the temples, and a face that held its lines in the way of a man who had made expensive decisions and accepted their cost without apology. He wore black, which was not the fashion among the county men that evening, and he carried himself as though the room's arrangement was a personal inconvenience he was prepared to tolerate. He greeted Lady Ashcroft with a courtesy that was technically irreproachable and contained no warmth whatsoever, a skill that appeared to require no effort on his part. His eyes moved across the assembled guests with the efficient patience of a man performing an inventory of his own. They stopped when they reached Cecily. She felt the attention the way you feel the change in temperature when someone opens a door. It was not warm, and it was not cold. It was simply present and specific and sustained for exactly 2 full seconds before she turned back to the sideboard. She had not come here for the Earl of Westhaven. She had come here for the missing ladle, and the 3 spoons she had confirmed by the time the fish course arrived were also absent from the collection. She catalogued the guests during the soup. Mr. Fothergill ate with the focused pleasure of a man who was seldom fed well. Lady Ashcroft spoke across the table to the Mrs. Pendleton about the difficulty of maintaining a large establishment without adequate funds, her voice carrying exactly the note of graceful suffering that Cecily recognized as Lady Ashcroft's most practiced register. Mr. Carew, Lady Ashcroft's nephew, sat at the lower end of the table and said very little, and watched the sideboard with the particular blankness of a man trying not to look at something specific. Cecily watched Mr. Carew. He was 28 and had lived at Thornvale on his aunt's invitation for the past 4 months. He had thin hands and an easy smile, and a manner of occupying a room that made it seem as though he had simply been placed there by some natural process, like furniture. He had twice suggested to Cecily, before she donned the apron, that she ought to be practical about the document and the guardianship and the reality of her situation. The first time he had said it in the drawing room, in the voice of a man offering a kindness. The second time he had said it in the library, in the voice of a man who had expected the kindness to have taken effect by now. She had met both suggestions with a silence he had apparently read as resignation, because he had not come to her a third time. He refilled his own wine before the footman could reach him, and his eyes returned to the sideboard 3 more times during the fish course. Each time his face was easy and his eyes were blank, and each time Cecily noted it in the part of her mind that was keeping its own inventory. She was, to the rest of the table, not there. Lady Ashcroft's gaze moved over her twice during the soup without pausing. The Mrs. Pendleton spoke across her as though she were a piece of furniture that had been placed between them for reasons of household management. Mr. Fothergill, to his credit, had the decency to say thank you when she refilled his glass, though he said it to the table rather than to her. The Earl of Westhaven saw her. She noticed it the way she noticed cold air at a threshold. He did not stare. He asked Lady Ashcroft a question about the Thornvale watermill and received an answer that Cecily, filling a glass 2 feet from his chair, could hear was wrong. Lady Ashcroft described the mill's capacity as roughly twice what it was and attributed the dispute over the Eastern Weir to a misunderstanding on the tenant farmer's part that had since been resolved. The Earl received this information with the expression of a man who knows a thing to be incorrect and has decided that this is not the moment to correct it. He lifted his own glass and turned his gaze away from the table and looked directly at Cecily for a single sustained moment, and in that moment his expression did not change at all. She moved to the sideboard. If you have found yourself wondering how a young woman in a servant's apron could hold that much stillness, stay close. She had learned it at her father's knee. He had taught her that the people who hold power in a room believe themselves unobserved by those who serve them. He had called it the greatest advantage a careful person could possess. It was not an advantage she had chosen. She had been born to this house, and this silver, and these rooms, and she had expected to live her life in them as their mistress. She had never expected to stand in this corridor with a ledger in her apron pocket, cataloging what was being removed from her, while 14 people ate off what remained. Here she stood. She intended to finish it. The second remove came and went. Cecily watched Mr. Carew excuse himself between the fish and the meat, a thing that none of the other gentlemen did. She watched the clock above the service corridor. He was gone 9 minutes. When he returned, his cuffs were straight, and his expression was the same easy blankness, and when he resumed his seat, he reached for his glass immediately. The reach was too practiced, too deliberate in its ease. She slipped out at the start of the third remove. The service corridor ran the length of the east wing and led out at its far end into the anteroom that connected to the silver pantry where the household's excess pieces were stored. Mrs. Poole kept the key on a ring with the rest of the household keys. The ring was kept in Mrs. Poole's room. Mrs. Poole was in her room with a swollen ankle. Cecily had had the key to the silver pantry since the second morning she had worked as Mrs. Poole's assistant, because Mrs. Poole had recognized her immediately and wept and given her every key on the ring without being asked. The silver pantry door was already ajar. Cecily stood in the corridor and looked at the thin line of candlelight visible through the gap and breathed. The light moved slightly, the flicker of a single candle rather than a lamp, which meant he had not planned to stay long. She pressed one hand against the stone wall beside the door and let herself be still for the length of 3 full breaths. She had been still for 9 days. She could manage 3 more breaths. Then she pushed the door open. Mr. Carew was there with a cloth bag and 2 candlesticks he had not yet managed to wrap. He startled badly enough to drop the nearer one, and it rang against the stone floor with a sound that Cecily felt in her teeth, and that traveled, she estimated, at least as far as the corridor junction. He recovered quickly. He was a man who recovered quickly. She had already understood that about him. "Miss Vane," he said. His voice was level. "This is not what it appears." "It is precisely what it appears," Cecily said. "Mr. Carew, you have been removing pieces from this household's inventory for at least 3 days, and I have the ledger that will demonstrate it." She produced the ledger from her apron pocket and held it open at the relevant pages so he could see her handwriting, precise and small, and her father's handwriting copied into the column headings above hers, the neat figures and dates and initials that had governed this silver since before either of them was born. His eyes moved over it. The easy smile did not return. "My aunt has the right to manage the household contents," he said. The document grants her authority to dispose of surplus. The document, Cecily said, is forged. The words sat in the pantry between them for a moment that stretched past comfort. The candle on the shelf behind Mr. Carew sent his shadow long across the stone floor, and Cecily held the ledger and waited. "I would be very careful," he said. And his voice had changed, the leveling gone from it, something sharper underneath. "About making that accusation in this house." "I'm not making it in this house," Cecily said. "I am making it in this pantry. I will make it in the dining room in approximately 6 minutes. The Earl of Westhaven is among the guests. He served on the commission that investigated the Haverstock forgery 2 years ago. I expect he will be interested in the quality of my father's signature on the 3rd page of a document my father did not sign." She had not been certain she would use the Earl. She had not been certain he knew anything of use, though something about the quality of his attention in the dining room had steadied that uncertainty considerably. She had read her father's letters carefully, and among the letters in the locked study desk, she had her father's correspondence with Lord Westhaven about the watermill dispute, and in that correspondence she had found not only the Earl's seal, but her father's marginal note that he was a man of scrupulous attention who does not permit himself to be misled. She had weighed that note more than once in 9 days of weighing things. Mr. Carew looked at her for a long moment. In the candlelight, his face had shed the easy social warmth it wore in the dining room, and what remained was younger and more frightened than she had expected. "You have been here a week," he said. "In an apron." "I have been here my whole life," Cecily said. "In a house." She closed the ledger and placed it back in her apron pocket. She left him with the candlesticks and the cloth bag and his candle going slightly crooked in its holder, and she walked back down the service corridor. The dining room was at the midpoint of dessert when she returned. She had removed the apron at the door to the service corridor and folded it over the hook where it belonged. She had removed the cap and smoothed the hair at her temples with the flat of her hands as best she could in the dark. She stood in the doorway, in the plain gray dress she had worn for the first 3 days of her father's mourning, before Lady Ashcroft had suggested gently that perhaps a period of withdrawal from company was advisable, and that the other guests might find it distressing, and the room turned toward her with the particular startled attention of people who have been looking in the wrong direction and are now being required to look at the right thing. It was the attention of 14 people making a rapid private reassessment of everything that had happened in the past 2 hours. Lady Ashcroft's face did something complicated. It moved through surprise into calculation, into a smile that arrived 3 full seconds after the expression that preceded it, a smile that was designed to suggest she was pleased and had been expecting this all along. "Cecily," she said, "we did not expect you." "No," Cecily said, "I imagine you did not." She walked to the head of the table. Her footsteps were the only sound in the room for 5 full paces. The candlelight on the dining table caught the crystal and the silver that remained, the pieces she had counted that morning, and was counting still. And she did not look at them, because she already knew their number. And this was not the moment for inventory. This was the moment for clarity. She stood beside her father's chair. She did not sit, because she had not come here to conduct herself as though she had already won. She placed the ledger on the white linen beside Mr. Fothergill's wineglass. "This is an inventory of the Thornvale silver," she said. "I have been keeping it for 9 days. As of this evening, 22 pieces are missing from the collection. I have observed Mr. Carew removing items from the silver pantry at the beginning of this remove. He is in the pantry now. I have also read the document Lady Ashcroft presented regarding guardianship, and I believe my father's signature on the 3rd page does not match the signature on any of the letters in his correspondence file, which I have retained." Mr. Fothergill looked at the ledger. He looked at Lady Ashcroft. His expression was the expression of a man recalculating several things at once. The room was very quiet. Lady Ashcroft's voice came from the far end of the table, steady and precise, and aimed like a woman who had survived many rooms by the quality of her aim. "My dear girl," she said, "you are overwrought. The loss of your father has been a very great strain. No one here doubts your sincerity. But to make these claims in company, without counsel, without evidence that has been properly verified, is the action of a young woman who needs protecting, not of one who is in any position to manage an estate." She said it without particular venom. That was the worst of it. She said it in the voice she might use to describe a very unfortunate weather event. "She is not unprotected." The Earl of Westhaven spoke from the middle of the table, and his voice was not loud, but the room's acoustics were those of a room built for formality, and his voice carried to every corner without effort. He had put down his spoon at some point during Cecily's accounting, and he had not picked it up again. He rose. He was not a tall man in the extravagant sense, but he stood as though the ceiling had been built to his measurement, and when he walked toward the head of the table, the guests on either side pulled their chairs slightly to give him passage without being asked. He stopped beside Cecily and looked at Mr. Fothergill. "I would like to examine the document Lady Ashcroft presented," he said. "I would also like to see Mr. Carew. If he is in the silver pantry, perhaps someone would be good enough to ensure he remains there until we have spoken." Lord Hargrove, who had been watching the whole exchange with the alert attention of a man who had sat on enough county committees to recognize a proceeding when it arrived uninvited at his dinner, pushed back his chair without hesitation and went toward the corridor. Mr. Fothergill produced the document. He produced it with the air of a man who had been holding it in reserve and was relieved to transfer its weight to someone else. The Earl spread it flat on the tablecloth and read it the way Cecily had imagined he would read it. Slowly. Entirely. Once through without expression, and then back to the third page. Cecily watched his face. She watched the slight change at the corner of his jaw when he reached the signature. It was the only change. Everything else remained composed. "Miss Vane," he said. He did not look up from the document. "You said you have retained the correspondence files. They are locked in my father's study. I would appreciate the opportunity to compare them." Now he looked up, and when he looked at her, his face was doing the same thing it had done when he first entered the room. Not warm, not cold, present. This is, in my opinion, a matter that requires the examination of someone with authority to speak to the question of signature forgery. I am acquainted with the magistrate for this county. I can have him here by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. "The document is valid," Lady Ashcroft said. Her voice had not lost its steadiness entirely, but the precision was gone from it, and something underneath was beginning to show. "Perhaps," the Earl said. "That will be for the magistrate to determine." He folded the document and placed it in his coat pocket with a finality that made Mr. Fothergill blink. "You cannot simply take that document," Lady Ashcroft said. "I can and have." He turned to look at her fully for the first time since he had risen. "Lady Ashcroft, I came here tonight because Thornvale's watermill dispute is a matter in which I hold a legitimate interest, and I was invited to discuss it over dinner. I did not come here expecting to find a young woman conducting her own household investigation from a servant's apron. I will confess I have not been surprised in a dining room in some years." He said the last sentence as though it were a statement of fact, and in his voice it carried the weight of considerable experience. Lady Ashcroft looked at him, and then at Cecily, and then at the ledger still open on the table beside Mr. Fothergill's glass. "She has been here a week deceiving this entire household," she said, and the elegance was gone now. The sentence clipped at its edges. "She has been here 9 days protecting her own property," the Earl said. "The distinction matters." Cecily stood at her father's chair and did not move, and did not speak, and did not look away from Lady Ashcroft, because there was nothing she could have said that would have been more useful than standing exactly where she was standing and letting the room take its own account of her. Lord Hargrove returned. Mr. Carew was with him, and Mr. Carew's easy smile was entirely absent, and his hands were in his coat pockets, and he looked at no one. The dinner ended very quietly after that. If you have stayed with Cecily this long, you already know how rarely quiet endings are the wrong kind. Leave a thought in the comments about the moment you knew. She is about to have a conversation in the corridor, and it will be worth waiting for. The guests departed in stages, the way guests do when the evening has concluded something larger than itself. Fothergill took his associate into the library with 2 candles and the document, though the document was no longer in his possession, and he seemed to find this arrangement confusing. The Misses Pendleton departed with a speed that suggested they had already composed the account they would give at the next gathering they attended. Lord and Lady Hargrove remained longer. Lord Hargrove spoke briefly to the Earl in the hall, and the exchange was low and deliberate, and ended with Lord Hargrove nodding once and putting on his hat. Lady Ashcroft withdrew to her rooms without speaking to Cecily again. Mr. Carew was asked to remain in the library by the Earl in terms that were polite and entirely inflexible, and he remained. Cecily was in the entrance hall when she heard the Earl come down the corridor behind her. She did not turn. She stood with her hand on the newel post and looked up the staircase toward the dark upper landing, toward the corridor where her father's study waited with its locked desk and its careful files. The entrance hall of Thornvale Park was high-ceilinged and cold at this hour, with the footmen gone and only 2 candles left burning in the sconces by the door, and in that light the hall looked exactly as it had looked every winter evening of her childhood when she had come downstairs in her nightgown on some excuse, and stood in this exact place, and put her hand on this exact post, and listened to the house breathe. She was still listening. "Miss Vane," the Earl said. She turned. He had come to a stop some 8 feet from her, which was the distance of a man who had calculated that closer would be an imposition and further would be an evasion. He had the look of a man who was choosing his next sentence with some care, not because he did not know what he wanted to say, but because he was the kind of person who made certain the words were accurate before he used them. He was close enough that she could see the gray at his temples more clearly than she had in the dining room, and the lines at the corners of his eyes that were not yet deep, but were the lines of a man who had done a great deal of looking at things, and had made himself record what he found. "I owe you an apology," he said. "You do not," Cecily said. "You owe me nothing. You have been in this house 3 hours. I saw you in the drawing room before dinner," he said. "I knew you were not Mrs. Poole's assistant. I did not know then what you were doing. But I knew what you were not. I chose to watch, rather than to act. If I had acted sooner, you would not have needed to walk into the dining room alone." Cecily considered this. She looked at the newel post and then back at him. "I did not walk in alone," she said. "I walked in with a ledger." His mouth did something. It was not quite a smile. The movement at the corner was brief and entirely controlled, and she had the distinct impression it was a thing that happened to him, rather than a thing he performed. "So you did," he said. He held the document out to her. She had not expected that. He had placed it in his coat pocket with the air of a man who intended to carry it straight to a magistrate, and she had been grateful, and now he was holding it toward her. "For tonight," he said. "In the morning, I would recommend it be in the custody of someone with no interested connection to either party. But tonight it is your father's house, and I do not believe you will sleep easily with it in my pocket." She took it. The paper was warm from his coat. She did not look at it. She looked at him. "Why did you come here tonight?" she asked. "Not the watermill. The watermill could have been resolved by correspondence." The pause before he answered was the kind that meant the real answer was being considered against the easier one. "Your father wrote to me in September," he said. He was concerned. He had found something in the household accounts that he could not reconcile, and he did not wish to accuse a member of his family without proof. He asked for my opinion on how to proceed discreetly. I sent a reply. He died before he received it. He said the last sentence flatly, the way a man says a thing he has spent time making himself say without weight. I came tonight because I wished to see for myself what his concern had been. I did not expect to find that his daughter had already found it, catalogued it, and laid it on a dinner table. Cecily was quiet. "He never told me he had written to you," she said. "He would not have," the Earl said. "He did not wish to alarm you until he was certain." He looked at her for a moment with that same quality of attention she had felt from across the dining room. "He described you in that letter, Miss Vane. He said you had his exactness and your mother's courage, and that he was very proud of you, and that he hoped your life would be quieter than the life you had seemed to choose for yourself by the particular way you paid attention to things." Cecily looked at the document in her hands. She pressed her thumb along its edge. "He was given to understatement," she said. "I gathered that from the letter." The clock in the hall struck 10. The sound fell through the house the way it always had, and after it the quiet was the particular quiet of a large house in which most of the candles had been put out, and only a few rooms were still occupied. "I should see to Mr. Carew," the Earl said. "He and I have a great deal to discuss, and I prefer to have it finished before morning." He did not move immediately. He stood for a moment with the specific stillness of a man who has said what he came to say, and has not yet decided whether there is more. "I should like to show you the correspondence files tomorrow," Cecily said. "If you are staying." He looked at her. "I had not planned to stay." "I know," she said. "I am asking regardless." The pause this time was different from the first one. It was the pause of a man who has been asked something that requires him to revise whatever he had planned to do next. "Then I will stay," he said. He said it simply, with the particular economy of a man who has decided to mean a thing rather than to hedge it. And she heard in it not only tomorrow morning's appointment with the correspondence files, but something that had not been said and did not need to be. She would think about that later. For now she had a document in her hand and a locked study upstairs, and 9 days of careful work that had arrived, tonight, at exactly the place it needed to arrive. She went up the stairs. He watched her go, and when she reached the upper landing, she heard him turn back down the corridor toward the library where Mr. Carew was waiting, and the sound of his footsteps was even and unhurried, the sound of a man who knew where he was going and was not in any particular hurry to pretend otherwise. The study was cold. She lit the lamp herself and sat at her father's desk and opened the locked drawer with the key she had carried since the morning after his funeral, the morning she had found the copy of Lady Ashcroft's document slipped under the study door, as though someone had thought she would simply accept it lying on the floor. She spread the correspondence before her. Her father's letters to the Earl's draft reply that had never been sent. She spread the document beside them and looked at the third page. The signature was wrong. She had known it from the first morning. The H in his name was the H of a man who had never fully learned not to loop it. A small imprecision her father had carried his whole life, and that she had seen on every letter he had ever written her. The H on the third page was straight. Clean. The H of someone who had been told what a signature looked like and had reproduced it without knowing the small flaw that made it real. She sat with the lamp and the papers for a long time. She sat until the clock struck 11, and then sat a little longer, in her father's chair, in her father's house, with a servant's apron folded over the arm of the chair beside her because she had set it down there when she came in, and not yet put it away. It would be put away tomorrow. Everything in its place, everything accounted for, every piece returned to the inventory. That was the work of tomorrow, and the day after, and the season ahead that would require a solicitor and a magistrate, and a great deal of careful attention. Tonight she sat in the quiet, and let the house settle around her. The cold stone and the candle wax and the smell of old paper, and she felt it as she had always felt it. Hers. Her father's before her and hers now, in the bones of it, in the inventory of it, in the way it breathed in winter. She was still sitting there when she heard footsteps in the corridor again. They were the Earl's. She recognized them by now. They stopped outside the door, and there was a pause, and then a knock. "Come in," she said. He opened the door, but did not enter. He stood in the doorway with the corridor dark behind him, and looked at her sitting at the desk with the papers spread around her, and the lamp making the room small, and the shadows very long. "Carew has given a full account," he said. Lady Ashcroft directed the removal of the pieces. He provided them to a dealer in Bath. The dealer has receipts. He said it steadily, as he said most things, and he was watching her face as he said it. And she understood that he was watching to see whether the confirmation of what she had already known would be the thing that finally moved her. It was a little. She looked back at the correspondence and pressed her lips together. "Thank you," she said. "The magistrate will be here at 9, he said. "I have sent word." A pause. "You should sleep." "I know," she said. She did not move. He looked at her for one more moment. "Cecily," he said. It was the first time. She looked up. "Your father was right about you," he said. The exactness and the rest of it. He said it without elaboration, in the same level voice he used for all his sentences, and in that voice it carried more than a declaration would have. He stepped back into the corridor. "Lord Westhaven," she said. He stopped. "My father would have liked you," she said. The pause that followed was long enough that she thought she had misspoken. Then, in the dark of the corridor, she heard the brief controlled sound she had been waiting to hear since the dining room. "Good night, Miss Vane," he said. She heard his footsteps down the corridor and away, steady and unhurried, toward the room that had been prepared for a guest who had not planned to stay. She turned back to her father's letters. The lamp burned down slowly in that cold room, and the house was quiet. And in the morning, there would be a magistrate, and a full accounting, and the long, careful work of setting things right. She knew how to do that work. She had her father's exactness. She had her ledger. She had 22 missing pieces and a receipt trail and a man in the library who had given an account. She also had the letter her father had written to the Earl in September, in which, she saw now, reading the last paragraph for the first time because she had stopped before it on every previous reading, he had said one more thing. He had said that he confessed to writing partly because "I am told Lord Westhaven is the sort of man who finishes what he begins. My daughter is exactly that sort of woman. I think they would understand each other." She folded the letter and held it for a moment. Then she placed it carefully in the drawer with the rest of his papers, and closed the drawer, and sat in her father's chair in her father's house with the lamp burning steadily, and let herself, at last, feel the weight of all of it and the rightness of all of it together. Outside, the first snow of winter was beginning to fall on Thornvale Park. It fell on the garden walls and the gravel and the gray stone of the house, and on the window of the study where a lamp still burned, and on the courtyard where the horses were stabled and the carriages stood that had brought 14 guests to a dinner that had settled rather more than one matter. It fell quietly, the way good things sometimes arrive, not announced and not performed, simply present when you looked up and found them there. If you stayed until this moment, you already know she kept the house. Leave a word in the comments for the women who counted their own silver and knew exactly what was missing, and what, in the end, was found.